Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker who will be having this conversation with me, Thomas Wolfe, who is the co-founder and chief scientific officer at Hugging Face, and we're going to talk all about open source AI and small models. Thomas, come on up. Let me sit here. Oh, you're going to take your, I'll move over then. Great. You ready? Yeah, it's a great T-shirt. It absolutely is. Thomas, why don't we start out by saying, just sort of giving an overview of why open source is important, and maybe actually a little bit on what is open source AI really for those who don't know. But what is it and why is it so important, do you feel?
So that's a question we could already spend 1 hour on,
yeah.
but let's keep it short. Open source AI is decided that just like open source in software has enabled us to have very resilient systems that are basically built by whole communities, I would say, we could also build AI in the same way. We could also build an AI so that it's not only kind of a private technology of a couple of labs, but it's more akin to kind of a common good, you know, like maybe Wikipedia has been something, I would say, that was built by a full community. The idea of open source AI is you can build AI in the open, you can share it openly. And I believe it's very important in particular because I think we're all here today because AI, we think, is going to be a breakthrough technology that's going to change a lot of things in the world. And if this breakthrough technology can be open, can be shared with everyone, I think we'll reap much more of the benefits of this revolution.
I hear what you're saying about the benefits, but a lot of people are very worried about the dangers of open source AI. They feel like these models are less secure. If the weights are available to anyone, it's very easy to figure out ways to attack those models using what are called prompt injection attacks. And there's a feeling that as these models get more powerful, having them open is potentially dangerous, particularly if they're going to have the ability to carry out actions that we might not want to be carried out, or if a bad actor wants to use them to create a better cyber attack or help engineer a bioweapon, that this is going to be problematic. I'm wondering how you respond to that criticism that open source is somehow more dangerous. Yes, there are benefits, but you're also exposing it to anybody to use however they wish, and that could be dangerous.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So it's quite interesting because
just 1 year ago, right, happened just here in London, the UK Safety Summit on the 1st November, so that's almost 1 year ago. And I think in the past year, we covered really deeply all these dangers in the newspaper. So basically, to summarize them, they range from misuse like deepfakes, or phishing attempts, I would say, more dangerous weapons like creating biochemical, nuclear, cyber attack, and maybe the most, fantasized one, which is AI rebelling against us, basically breaking its chains and destroying humanities. And so I think open source in general is quite orthogonal to the direction of risk benefits. Openness bring access to the technology to many people. It kind of bring many use cases, many effects. But in general, we see, just like in software, because software and computer are basically also a dual-use technology that we are using every day. With my computer, I can program a virus. I can also program something that's more useful, that's more positive. Openness is basically something that will both increase the risk and the benefits. So you will have more accessibility of the technology for bad actors, but you will have also much more resiliency of the system because everyone will be able to inspect them in details, and you will have also an easier way to build countermeasures, basically, because many teams can work on making the counter system or making the system more robust. So basically, just like today, we see already misuse by closed system, right? Deepfakes are usually made today by closed source system. I think we'll see in the future, basically, these two things cohabiting together, cohabiting along each other, and it won't really range as simply as we think, which is open source have all the risks, basically, and closed source has all of the benefits. These are basically a much more complex spectrums.
Yeah, and do you think it'll sort of play out the same way it has played out in other kinds of software, where the open source software maybe initially is less secure, but ultimately is more secure because, as you say, there's more people kind of scrutinizing it and finding the holes and then finding ways to potentially secure those holes?
Yeah, exactly. Just like we saw, you remember, right? A couple of weeks ago, we had all the airports paralyzed by a Microsoft issue, right? This is kind of the problems we do have in closed source system, because much less people take a look at them. When you have an issue, it's quite harder to find it. I think maybe the crux of the problem is we tend to think a lot about AGI and this kind of a very doomsday scenario, because we have a lot of films, we have a lot of books that talks about this. But I think much more realistically, what we'll see is a kind of a lot of smaller AI assistants basically permeating everywhere in our world. So this won't be, like extremely smart thing. This will be kind of just useful assistance. And I think for a lot of these, it will be very useful if they are open instead of being closed.
Yeah, I know we were speaking earlier, and you really feel that small open models are going to be increasingly important, particularly to the idea of AI on device, right? An AI that you might have on your phone, on your laptop, maybe even on smaller devices, and that won't have to be constantly in communication with the cloud, and that this will be important to sort of realize the benefits that we want from AI. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, why is it so important to have these smaller models, and why do you think the open version of these smaller models might ultimately become kind of predominant?
Yeah, I think AI is this technology that have the potential to do many things, and it will have in the future many forms. Today we're kind of used to this very chatbot, interface. We have this one AI we talk a lot, which is either ChatGPT or maybe Claude if you're a bit adventurous. But in the future, I see this much more being diffused, just like our smartphone, or just like internet has diffused basically in everything we interact with. AI will be like this. So we'll have small AI models on our cell phone that will help us for like, I don't know, simple tasks that they can do with phrasing something, translating something, summarizing something. These tasks that are actually useful, I would say, day to day. And we have much more bigger and more complex models that will be, this could be also closed source, that's fine, but that we'll use for specific tasks.
Right.
And what we saw in the past year is these smaller models are actually able to do much more than we thought was possible. So it's really in the realm of possible to have a model, an AI model running on your cell phone, on your smartphone, that can do actually very useful tasks.
Yeah, you mentioned that we've just seen Meta come out with a model that 3.2, Llama 3.2, that is actually at quite a small size and yet more powerful. It's sort of leading on some of the benchmarks at the moment compared to larger models, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So just this week there was the new Llama 3.2 model, which has a two smaller size version. One is 1 billion parameter, and when you evaluate it on the leaderboard and also on the chatbots, basically. You see that the 1 billion parameters model is as powerful as Llama 2 was, the 13 billion parameter Llama 2 of last year. So basically in 1 year we had kind of the same capabilities in the size that was divided by 10. I think having a AI model running on your smartphone and basically locally would be very useful for many things. So you won't have to need constant internet connection. You won't have to send your data all the time. You will have a much better privacy. It will be also much more interesting in terms of energy efficiency. We won't have to concentrate all the computation in data center, but we can offload some of this energy consumption of models to, like closer to the user system that are closer to the user, maybe in better power grid, like European power grid is usually better than the US one, and this type of advantage.
Yeah, you talk about the energy efficiency, and that's of course one kind of power. There's also sort of market power, and one of the issues we've had with AI so far is it's a technology that seems to be concentrating power in the hands of just a handful of large technology companies. I mean, if you look at sort of where the leaders are in sort of frontier models, it's the same handful of companies. It's OpenAI, it's Google, Microsoft, Meta to some extent, although Meta is open sourcing the models, but it's only a handful of companies. Can you talk a little bit about why open source is, you feel, an important antidote to this issue of power being concentrated as this technology develops?
Yeah, definitely. I think open source is is a huge vector of democratization and access to the technology to many people, right? If you want to fine-tune a model to your specific use case, you're on your startup working, I don't know, in finance tech, fintech, or like low tech, and you want to adapt one model to your specific use case, it will be much easier to start from an open source model, and which feel also much more in control as a company to build on top of that. So that's one of the reasons we see also a huge startup ecosystem in Europe around this model, and kind of this rise of Europe, I would say, recently on the AI scene, which is very promising. And if we only had like closed source model, we could not really see these type of things. So now the general question is it bad to have just a few actors, doing AI for everything? So there's part of it is maybe your philosophical opinion. I think in general, I like much more, I think a world that's decentralized and where AI technology is built by everyone is much more resilient, is much more, has much more also opportunities for people to bring new use case on the table. Yeah.
One of the big questions is, okay, open source sounds great, but can you make any money selling open source stuff or making it available for free as Hugging Face does? I was interested to learn that you said Hugging Face is actually cash flow positive, which is really rare for an AI company. But yeah, how are you doing as a business, and how are you ever going to make a lot of money out of open source?
It's a big question. I mean, maybe the first surprising thing indeed is that you would say, AI is a place where money is hard to make, and open source AI is maybe even worse. And surprisingly, we're, I think today, one of the rare company that's indeed around cash flow positive. Not that we really have that as a target, actually, because we did raise money recently, so it's not really our main target. But I think in general, there's a lot of business use case and there's a lot of way to make money in AI that we haven't explored yet. So I think this is just us would be one example. I think we tend to think that the only way to make money is just to train a large language model and then sell the tokens of this model. I think this is a bit similar to thinking at the early time of the internet that the only way to make money on the internet would be to make website for people, which obviously now, is just maybe the first way we found, but we then have like Airbnb, Amazon, Stripe, like huge companies that were built on the internet but made money in very interesting vertical. I think we'll see the same in LLM right now. Everyone is talking about training model and selling them. But in general, I think a longer term will be obviously smartly integrating AI as part of a very well-defined business. That's where money is going to be. Yeah.
And at the moment, how is Hugging Face making that money it's making now? You say you're cash flow positive. Where's that coming from? Which of those opportunities have you taken advantage of?
Yeah, we have many ways, actually. The nice thing is we have a very large community, which is actually also growing. And this week is quite nice because we passed actually 1 million open model on Hugging Face, which is a milestone we had. And you have even more. Yeah. And several million users. So one part of it is just the traditional open core business model, which is usually around consulting, I would say. But we also have a set of products on Hugging Face which are working really well. So you can pay for compute, you can pay for some services, training that we have, and this is actually growing also very strongly. Right. So we're quite optimistic, I'd say. Yeah.
And you mentioned, obviously, how you're making money, but of course, one of the big issues with AI has been, for a lot of businesses, can they get the return on investment from the technology? They're very excited about, a lot of people are very excited about the technology, but a lot of businesses are having trouble figuring out how to get a return on investment. I guess open models and open source models is one answer to that, potentially, right? Because you're not at least paying for the model, and you have much more control over, you have to pay for the hosting, potentially, but you have much more control over the use than when you're, just beholden to someone else for whatever they want to charge for the tokens, right?
Yeah, for sure, of course. What we see a lot in our case is people who start with a quick proof of concept on closed source model because they are quite easy. You can just quickly, try something, and then when they actually move to a much more robust and production-ready solution, they move to open source system that then they either host themselves or find, a provider. The nice thing, even for open source model, is you take every model and you usually have like 5 to 10 people who can deploy it for you, 5 to 10 companies who can deploy it for you. You can compare. There's a lot of competition on price per token, which is also, I think, very healthy. So you have a lot of alternative to also just hosting, deploying yourself. Yeah. And then you can obviously, the great things, you can fine-tune it specifically on your use case. You have the full control around what data you use to fine-tune and how you evaluate, etc.
Right. We mentioned Meta and their Llama 3.2 model. Meta's kind of been leading in freely available models that are the most powerful. But there's some controversy over that. They call their models open source. True sort of adherents of open source software have been very critical of Meta, saying it's not really open source. It should be called something else because there are some restrictions on the licensing. What's your view, Thomas, on this whole controversy? Where do you come down? Should Meta be able to call it open source AI?
Yeah, I would say I put the philosophy, before the exact words. So obviously, yeah, this doesn't fall exactly in the open source software, but also open source software is something that's not truly adapt to AI. So there is currently a lot of work from the foundation of open source software on what would be, the right definition for software, for open source software for AI, where you have this data, you have this not only lines of code, but you have something that's quite different. In general, I think we have this wide spectrum of open model. It goes from very closed model that you can't even access through an API to open, more open. Some models like Llama are maybe somewhere in the middle. Some models like Mistral are maybe a bit more, open in terms of licensing. And then you can even go further where you start to also open source your data, the data that you use, and the code that you use to train. And you go to basically the extreme where you actually build everything in public, which is a project we did a couple of years ago called Big Science, where we decided we were going to train a model fully publicly and show all the data we use and all the code. That's maybe fully extreme, I would say. I don't think everyone has to go there. Just like in open source, everyone doesn't have to use a GPL license, right? But this diversity is very healthy, I think. It's a great part.
So sort of gradations of openness, and maybe we should start saying semi-open or something like that.
Yeah.
One of the big issues that's come up for AI in general, but certainly it seems particularly pressing for open source AI has been the issue of regulation, and how is regulation going to address open models? I'm curious, here we're in the UK, but not too far from Europe. I want to know what your view is of sort of the EU AI Act, and has it gotten it right, and do you feel like the way it's applied to open source makes sense? And what would you like to see beyond that in terms of regulation in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think first it's great. I think that we start to have some regulation. It's quite clear for social media we came a little bit late with regulation. I think here it's great that we start thinking early. The European Act right now is quite balanced in the way it's try to gradate risk and not put everyone in the AGI category, which is very, very nice, I think. Then the question will be, where does this boundary falls, obviously? And probably the thing that I hope we'll be able to avoid, which is I hope we'll be able to avoid some kind of regulatory capture, basically, in Europe, where just the costs of being able to fulfill the requirements for the regulation would be so high that you de facto end up with having just a couple of companies who can do that. So I hope we'll have something that has this smooth entry, so that startup can also participate, and so that we can foster this European ecosystem of small companies who try to use AI and deploy it in various places. But if we can do that, I'm pretty positive. I'm pretty optimistic.
Right. But you feel like some regulation is actually kind of useful for the field.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is technology that's gonna be everywhere in the future. So we have to think about the consequences, definitely.
Right. Cool. One of the things Hugging Face is really known for and provides a great service for the community with is benchmarking. You have these leaderboards where people like to show that their model's at the top or test how their model's doing on these leaderboards. But we were having a discussion that right now all the leaderboards are sort of based on how one model performs against another model, or how it performs against a benchmark that's usually against human performance. But of course, how these models are actually being used by companies is right now mostly as a kind of assistant for people, and yet there are no benchmarks benchmarks that really show how do these models help humans perform better. You know, how does a human perform with the model versus when they're not assisted by the model? I'm curious what your view is on the potential for those kind of benchmarks. Do you feel like that would be a good thing? Could Hugging Face help create a leaderboard like that?
Yeah, I think that would be great, just like we were discussing. I think right now we tend to think about AI in this very simplistic form, right, where we just think AI is going to replace this job or this job. Can AI replace this job or this job? But that's so basic, because AI can do much more things. It can complement this job. It can also complement someone to create this new type of job that we don't think about. So thinking about AI as working with humans is something we don't do a lot. Evaluating it, developing AI that's specifically made to work with humans, you know, like, I don't know, like Copilot type of thing, but generalized. I think this is something super interesting. It's not explored so much by the big AI firms, because it requires you to actually have a lot of domain expertise. It requires you to understand how a job is done, or to understand how you can work with a model efficiently. But that's something I would hope we would see more. Now, the main problem is to make good benchmark for this, you need humans.
Right.
And humans are expensive.
Right, expensive, yeah. And not as scalable, I guess, either, yeah. No, absolutely. Well, that's great. Obviously, Hugging Face kind of came out of France, and you know, you have people in the US now, and then there's been quite a lot of open source development in Europe. You know, Mistral is out of France as well. I'm curious how you see different countries, particularly in Europe, developing on this technology. You know, who do you sort of see as ahead, or why have certain places managed to kind of create these ecosystems that seem to be doing very well at creating AI startups at the moment?
I mean, for the record, we were created in the US,
okay,
right? And
at
at some point, we were a fully American company, where I was the only one in Europe at some point. But that's very true that, in particular, after COVID, really, we came back to Europe. And now, because Europe is so exciting, actually, I don't even fly so much anymore to the US, because there is so many things happening here. And yeah, the different countries we saw, they're moving a lot, right? The UK was very strong at some point with DeepMind and then Stability AI and like these very strong startups. And then surprisingly, France came a bit later, right, with Mistral. And Germany is also quite well located, but I would say with Aleph Alpha, but more than that, also a lot of talents there. So yeah, it's moving a lot, and quite clearly, it's also a function of regulation and government, you know, pushing or not for AI. It's quite clear that you see in France, Macron, you have like, and in the UK as well, you have younger, maybe, you know, members of the parliament who really understand that this is a technology that's going to be fundamental and try to push for it. And you see the effect, I think, in the attractiveness. So, yeah, I hope this is something we see more in Europe, in more countries as well. Yeah.
Right. And do you think open source sort of helps to foster those ecosystems, because anybody can kind of take the model and play with it and expand on it and build?
Yeah, for sure. It lowers a lot the entry cost, right? If the entry cost for you is to understand all the technology behind GPT-4 and then to train one, it's really high, right? But if you can just bootstrap with some open source model and you already fine-tune it and you try to build your POC on top of it, it's really something that a lot of startups can do, yeah.
Great. Well, Thomas, we're about out of time. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for listening. I also want to say that CogX has managed to secure some complimentary copies of my book, Mastering AI, which I'll be signing after this, about 10 minutes from now, in the 1871 bar downstairs to the left as you walk in. But thank you all for listening, and Thomas, thank you for joining us and talking about open source AI and the importance of small models.
Thank you.
Thank you.